Welcome to OB-Xa V by Arturia. This is a course that will cover everything in this wonderful recreation of the famous Bberheim synthesizer from the 80s. Now, first I'm going to cover the main panel here and all the different options. Next, we'll cover the extended panel with the modulation options, modulation metrics, the effects, and then we'll create some sounds in the sound design section. So let's get started. Let's explore the main panel. From left to right, we have the master section with volume, hold, chord selection, and master tuning. Next, we have the voices section with unison, stereo, and panning spread controls. The modulation section includes an LFO that can be assigned to oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and the filter. In OB-Xa V, we have two oscillators, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. Each can be set to one of four different wave shapes. The filter in this synthesizer is a low-pass filter. In this section, we also have the volume control for oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and noise. In addition, we can set 12 or 24 dB per octave slope for the filter. There are two envelopes, a filter envelope and a loudness envelope. We'll explore envelopes in detail in a later section. Arturia included an arpeggiator, which is not part of the original unit. We also have Portomento to control the sliding between notes and Vibrato. In our next section, we'll explore in greater detail each of these sections and create some sounds. So let's get started. Let's set the synthesizer to the default preset. We'll click All Types, Template, Default. This is how it sounds. This is a sawtooth waveform, and later on we'll see how we can create very interesting and very complicated sounds just by starting out with this sound. The master section. The master section includes a volume control that goes from -60 dB to 0 dB. Double clicking will get you back to -20 dB, which is the default. The hold button is very interesting. When engaged, when you're playing anything, it will hold the notes until released. Next, we have chord and select buttons. When engaging the chords, you have to select which chord, and this is the way to build it. So right now, we have only one note which is playing. Now I'm going to select two more notes. So every note that I play on the keyboard will create a chord based on this shape. And I can create other types of chords. To release the chord, just click the button again. Next, we have the master tuning. This goes from -12 semitones to +12 semitones. Double clicking will get you back to 0. The voices section. Here we can engage the unison button in order to stack up to 8 different voices together, and by turning the detune button, we'll get a full and lush sound. Let's try it out. We can control the number of voices by clicking the number below here, unison, and we can set it, for example, to 2. This will give us a more subtle effect. Of course, using more voices will consume more CPU. The OB-Xa V includes stereo and pan spread controls. Let's explore that using our stereoscope. So right now I'm clicking the pan, and hovering over this section I can see shadowed voice pan controls. Let's click that to reveal, and now I can set each voice to different panning position. For now I'm going to set it for left, right, and so we can hear and see the full effect. Now I'm going to set the spread all the way to the right. That's 100%. And let's see and hear what happens. So each voice that is played is going from left to right according to the position set in the voice span. When I'm playing several notes together, that's the effect. A spread across the stereo field. Next, we have the stereo spreading options. Clicking that will reveal that section here. And we have three different elements to affect the LFO, the oscillator, and the filter. Let's start with the filter. We didn't really explore the filter yet, but it's not very complicated, and we'll get to that later on. So right now I'm going to engage the filter all the way, and let's play something. Right now nothing happens. Let's engage the spread button here. We already see something going on. We already see that the sound spread across the stereo field. Next, we can do something with the filter itself. So let's set the filter to, let's say, somewhere in the middle here, around 200 Hertz, and set the resonance to 0.5. And now let's set the amount. We can already see that we have more of the sound spreading across the stereo field. But now let's engage the rate. So we're going from 0 to 3 Hertz. See the filter indicator here. This creates a lot of movement and very interesting sounds. Next, let's explore the oscillator. So I'm going to engage the oscillator all the way, and we can already see the movement. This creates a microtonal effect on the oscillator, and again really makes the sound wider and more interesting. Double click will get us back to 0. Next, let's explore the LFO. So again, modulation will be covered in a different section, but for now let's try and see how that works. So I'm going to engage the LFO all the way, and now I need to set the LFO to affect either oscillator 1 or 2. So let's do that and use the depth control here. And we can also set the rate. And we can hear the effect of the LFO. Later in this course, of course, we'll explore the modulation and oscillators and filters in more depth. The oscillators. This is the most important part of the synthesizer. This is where the sound actually originates. And in OB-Xa V, we have two oscillators, oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and they have the same types of waveforms, but together they can create more complex sounds and more complex waveforms. And now let's explore that. So first of all, the difference between them is that the first oscillator can move between octaves. So let's hear that. While the second oscillator can move between semitones. So we have 0 semitones and 60 semitones. But in order to have oscillator 2 engaged, we have to turn on the volume. And this is the time to talk about the mixing between them. So when you're creating sounds that involve oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, it's a good idea to mix them together in such a way that you'll get the sound that you're looking for. So let's get oscillator 1 a little bit down and have oscillator 2 also around the same value. And you can hear the effect. Now, right now, we have the sync button engaged, which means that we are creating a synchronization between oscillator 2 and oscillator 1. And in essence, what happens is that since these are oscillators, they oscillate, they repeat themselves over time, oscillator 2 will restart every time oscillator 1 restarts. But I can disengage this. So you'll get different sounds. Now, of course, the resulting sound really depends on the combination of the frequencies and the way you're setting it up. Oscillator 2 also have a detune button, and it goes from -1 semitone to +1 semitone. Double-clicking will get you back to the default position. Next, the controls here down below are for the waveforms. So we have 4 waveforms. First of all, we have the sawtooth. Next, we have the square. And let's disengage oscillator 2 so we get the full effect from oscillator 1. And you can see here in the scope how it looks. But when you're engaging the square waveform, you can also use the pulse width control. And again, double click will get you back to the default. Next, if you engage both of them, you'll get the combination of a sawtooth and a square. And when you're disengaging both of them, you'll get a triangle. So again, we have sawtooth, we have square, we have triangle, and we have a combination of sawtooth and a square. X mode is a very interesting control. It is here between oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, and it controls the amount of cross-modulation that will be applied to oscillator 1 from oscillator 2. And this will allow us to create some ring modulator type sounds. So let's try that out and see how it works. This is without. Let's sync the 2 oscillators. And let's play with some of the other controls here in envelopes that we'll learn shortly. The filter section. The filter section is very important. This is where we are cutting off, we're removing frequencies, and in this synthesizer we have a low pass filter, which means that we are removing the high frequencies, allowing the low frequencies to pass. Let's hear and also see how it looks. Next, we have the resonance control, and this is a boost around the cutoff point. So the frequency control will control the cutoff, where we are starting to cut off to attenuate the high frequencies. And as you can see here in the analyzer, we have a little boost, a little bump around the frequency cutoff. This is very, very useful when we are sweeping across the frequency range and when we are automating things using the modulation or the other controls that we'll see further in the course. Next, we have the mode, which is, again, very, very important in order to create some filter automation using the filter envelope. And so in order for us to understand this, we need to understand the concept of envelopes. And this will be the topic of the next lesson. So we'll get there very soon. But in the filter section, we also have the volume control for oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and we can also engage some noise to create some more interesting sounds. We also have the option to create a slope that is very sharp using the 4-pole control. And this is a 24 dB per octave slope, while the default is 12 dB per octave slope. While the default is 12 dB per octave slope. When engaging the track button, we can modulate the frequency cutoff with the keyboard. So if we are playing higher notes or lower notes, that will affect the frequency cutoff. Envelopes. In this synthesizer, we have two envelopes, one for the filter and another one for the overall volume, for the loudness. Now, this is a very fundamental concept in synthesis, and I'll try and give you the best explanation and the easiest way for you to understand this. So, well, let's start with the loudness envelope, because this is very easy to understand. First of all, we have the attack button. The attack will set the time for the volume to reach its maximum velocity. So for example, if we set this to around half a second, 500 milliseconds, let's see how that evolves over time in the scope. And as you can see, it takes about half a second for the sound to reach its maximum velocity. Now if we'll turn this all the way to 1 second, it will be even slower. So you can imagine that this is very useful when you're creating pads or evolving sounds. Next, let's talk about the release. So when I'm playing on the keyboard, I'm hitting the keys and it takes some time for the sound to reach its maximum velocity set by the attack. But when I take my finger off the keyboard, the sound is either disappears immediately or can linger on or fade away, and this is controlled by the release. So let's set that to around 1 second. So again, very, very simple. The attack will control the amount of time that it will take for the sound to reach its maximum velocity. The release will control the amount of time for the sound to fade away once I release my finger from the keyboard. Next, we have the sustain and decay. So when I'm playing the keyboard, as long as I'm pressing the keys, as long as my finger is on the key, playing the note, that is called the sustain cycle. And I can set a different volume, a different velocity for that period of time between the attack and the release. And so I can set this, for example, to 50%. and play something, and you'll see that we are reaching slowly to the maximum value of the gain or the velocity, and then we'll drop to 50% of that. Let's try it. Now, if I want that drop to be slower, to take more time, I can set the decay. So for example, I can set this to half a second, just approximately half a second. And what I'm expecting to happen here is for the sound to reach its maximum velocity after 1 second. Then we'll have a drop to 50% of the volume after half a second. And when I'm releasing my finger from the keyboard, it will take about 1 second for the sound to fade away. Let's see how that works. Now I can set the sustain to something really low, and what will happen is that we'll reach the maximum velocity and then drop immediately to almost nothing. Let's try that. But what would happen if I'll set the attack to something really, really fast? So we'll get something more plucky. Of course, I can play with the different shapes of the oscillator and get different sounds. And now let's see how that works when we are actually using some of the other controls that we already covered. So for example, I can add some unison and detuning. Stereo spreading. And different types or different shapes of waveforms. Filter envelope. The same concept of attack, decay, sustain, and release can be applied to the filter cutoff point. So right now, this is how we have things set up. So we have the filter cutoff at 200 Hertz. And I can set the resonant to something like 600.600. And this is how it sounds. But when I'm sweeping the frequencies, this is how it sounds. So I want to automate that, and I can do it using the filter envelope. So I'll set the attack to something like half a second. And what it means that this knob here, this control, will be automated over time. It will take half a second for the filter to open up. And if I'll get this to 1 second, it will take more time. Next, we have the release. So the release will control the return of the frequency cutoff to the original position when I'm leaving the keyboard, when I'm releasing my finger from the keyboard. But we don't see any effect, we don't hear the effect, and this is because we need to match the release of the filter envelope and the loudness envelope. So when we are playing something, eventually the sound goes through the amplifier, and this is controlled by the loudness envelope. So we need to match those releases. We need to have the loudness envelope sustain and release the sound and match what we have in the filter envelope. Now the resonance is very important. The more you have resonance, the more wah-wah sound you'll get when you're sweeping over the frequency range. Experiment with different wave shapes. The arpeggiator. When playing a chord, we can use the arpeggiator to arpeggiate and play the notes in sequence. So let's turn on the arpeggiator, set the rate, and it can be synced to our BPM or free. And we can set the pattern. So right now it is as played, but we can also set it to up, down, 1, up, down, 2, and random. Let's try them all. Octave controls the notes that will be played either in the same octave or will range into other octaves as well. The Portomento section. This creates a sliding effect between the notes played. Now, in order to appreciate this effect, I think it would be best to move to square waveform. This is how it sounds right now. And let's set the time to something else. And we are sliding from one note to another smoothly. Now, clicking the quantize button will get us moving in semitone parts. The vibrato section. This creates a fast pitch bending effect, and we can set it to oscillator 1, oscillator 2, or both of them. So let's try it out and see how it works. Now let's engage the depth and the rate. We can also set the shape of the movement. Later on, we'll see that we can automate the depth and create an effect that the vibrato is actually engaged towards the end of the playing. Sort of when we are releasing the finger from the keyboard, then we want to have the vibrato to operate on the release time. At the bottom left corner, we have the pitch bend controls. We can set it from 1 semitone to 2 octaves. Let's see how that works. And we can also engage the oscillator 2 only button, and now we'll control only oscillator 2 with the pitch bend. So let's have oscillator 2 in play. We can hear oscillator 1 in the background while oscillator 2 is pitch bending. We also have the modulation wheel here, but we need to modulate that using some of the more advanced controls. The modulation section. In this section we have an LFO that can modulate oscillator 1, oscillator 2, the filter and the volume. Let's see how that works. The LFO section includes a rate control. It runs freely in Hertz, but it can also be synced to our host. Next we have the wave shape of the LFO: sine, triangle, sawtooth, ramp, square, and random using sample and hold. Now let's see how to use that LFO and modulate oscillator 1 frequency. First we'll click the button here. Next we'll set the depth all the way to the right and play a note. As we increase the rate, we can hear the difference. Well, of course, if we're using it in free Hertz mode, then it will be much smoother when we are changing the rate. Let's go back to the defaults now and see how to use the LFO and modulate the pulse width of the first oscillator. So first, let's use a square waveform, and now let's do it manually. Next, let's engage the oscillator 1 pulse width modulation and set the depth all the way. Again, this is very useful in sound design. Next, let's see how different wave shapes create. Next, let's see how different wave shapes affect the sound that we get. And we can go back and modulate oscillator 1 frequency, for example. And let's increase the release so we get some nice fadeaway sound. Very cool. Let's try something else. And let's see how the sample and hold works. Now, this is really happening because we are changing the pitch of oscillator 1, and this is exactly what is expected. When we are changing the pitch with a sample and hold, we are moving between different values of pitch, and that's different notes. Let's go back to the default setting and see how to use the modulation and modulate the filter. So let's click the filter frequency and let's set the filter cutoff point around the middle here. Next, let's engage the depth. And we can use the rate to increase the effect here. And we can sync it to our host. And this is how you can create echoing even without any special effects. That's the idea. So finally, let's see how to use the LFO and modulate the volume. Going back to the default, clicking the volume. Let's set the depth all the way. Of course, we can go anywhere in between to get the desired effect. And we can change the waveform to something else. And last, we have the key retrigger, which is basically retriggering or resetting the LFO with every key pressed. We've concluded the first part of this course, so let's recap and see if we forgot anything. The master section includes master volume, hold button, chord selection, and master tuning. The voices section includes unison and detuning, stereo and pan spreading. The modulation section includes one LFO that can modulate oscillator 1 and 2 frequencies and pulse widths, the filter, and volume. We have 2 oscillators, and we can select between 4 different wave shapes. Next, we have one filter, which is a low-cut filter, and we also have controls for the volume of oscillator 1 and 2, and we can introduce some noise into the play here. Next, we have envelopes. In this synthesizer, we have 2 envelopes, one for the filter and another one for the overall loudness. We also have a vibrato section, Portomento to create slides between notes, and Arpeggiator. So I'll see you in the next section where we put everything together and create some cool sounds. See you there.